Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Somewhat Scholarly. My name is Alan Hibbard, and today I am joined by a very special guest, the host of the Bitcoin Rapid Fire podcast, Mr. John Vallis. John, how you doing?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Alan. It's good to be here.
Yeah, well, thank you for taking the time today. We have so many things we can talk about. Obviously, Bitcoin. Bitcoin is probably the main thing. But of course, that leads down about 100 other rabbit holes. And yesterday, I listened to your most recent podcast with Michael Krieger, which is 2.5 hours. And, you know, when I sit down to listen to a podcast of that length, usually I'm like, okay, 1.5 speed. Maybe I'm going to go for a walk or multitask in some way. And I started listening to that episode and I just went, okay, 1.0. And I'm sitting down with pencil and paper. And I paused it so many times to take so many notes and think about it. I could not believe how dense that was and how many different amazing philosophical profound things you guys talked about. I spent about 5 or 6 hours listening to a 2.5 hour. I couldn't believe it. It was amazing. I took 2 pages of notes. So if you want, we can maybe go deeper down any of those topics or talk about anything. What's on your mind?
Well, first of all, I'm happy to go wherever you want to take it. I mean, that that chat with Michael was completely organic as well. So that's always my preference for these sorts of things. But what's on my mind? I mean, Bitcoin is always on my mind for a number of reasons. One, because I just think it's the macro narrative in the world today. Now, a lot of people will obviously disagree with that. So that's my opinion, that it is the kind of meta narrative happening in the world today, and everything is subordinate to that. And because of what Bitcoin is, from a financial perspective, as in money, and from a sociocultural phenomenon perspective, I think it touches almost everything. And I think it's highly influential in a lot of very important issues that we're facing today. So that's why I'm thinking about Bitcoin most of the time. And that's why I focus my energy on trying to understand all the different tangential topics that surround Bitcoin and money, and and as we may discuss, it bleeds into a lot of other things. And I've been really enjoying digging into really what's going on with the cultural phenomenon emerging around Bitcoin, because for the uninitiated, you might think, oh, okay, a digital currency, I kind of starting to get it. Yes, governments print a lot of money, and this is a way to maybe preserve some of your wealth so it can't be inflated away. That reasoning is starting to resonate with a lot of people, I think. And they're getting over the hurdle of appreciating digital scarcity and understanding that it can actually exist, and maybe they're trying to wrap their heads around that. But very few people, other than people deep in Bitcoin, are even aware that there's a growing cultural phenomenon emerging around this. And I've had the good fortune of kind of having a front row seat and being able to talk to a lot of these people, both from the, well-known experts and entrepreneurs to the people that came into the space, a month ago, and being able to witness the changes in their mindsets and their perspectives. And then as a result of that, their behavior and their ambitions and how they construct their lives effectively. And it's really peculiar because we have this digital protocol on the internet that is radically transforming people's lives. And for a number of different reasons, which maybe we'll get into, but one of them, and one of the more powerful ones, I think, is it's giving a lot of people hope where there was despair prior to that. And that is such an underappreciated motivator. When people look out on the horizon, we look out on their future, 5, 10, 50 years, and they see, and they're excited by it, and they see hope and possibility and potential rather than despair and destruction and all that kind of stuff, it fundamentally changes how you wake up and engage the world on a daily basis. And with that energy, people are taking that energy and trying to understand it better and trying to use it in their own lives and trying to construct the best life that they can. And then this community of people, this rabid, raucous, community, amorphous blob of people that is the Bitcoiners all over the world. There's this there's like this urgency of trying to refine your perspective and trying to keep up with the understanding of what this is on every domain that it impacts. And it's really cool, for people that are intellectually curious, right? So for people that don't just kind of swallow the dogma that they've been handed down and who like to think for themselves, it's a dream, because it's this group of people that are like, not only are they all kind of dancing around this super significant, meaningful phenomenon, but they're also all like kind of trying to one up each other on trying to understand what it means. And what it produces is just like this, like I said, a global community of people that are dead set on like continuing to refine their perspective and their understanding as fast as they can in relation to each other, and kind of using each other to sharpen one another. Not in most cases, a conscious way. We're all just here. And when someone drops a great article or a good book recommendation or drops a great insight on Twitter, we're all just like, holy shit. Yes. Like I got to dig further into that. And so my trying to understand that is probably the most fascinating thing to me right now, is what culture is emerging, and appreciating, of course, that it's too, I don't want to be, we can't cast a too exclusive a net over this culture, but just more broadly saying, like, what are some of the hallmarks of what's happening, what's emerging, and why? And that's what consumes all my attention. And that's why that's directing a lot of my reading these days. And, starting to write as well, and trying to understand the cultural phenomenon that's being produced by a global, decentralized, absolutely scarce sound money for the first time.
Yeah.
And it's pretty wild.
it is pretty wild. And like, I totally agree with you, and it all resonates with me. And the thing that blows my mind is trying to explain it to someone who doesn't already get it. And it's virtually impossible. You got to be infinitely patient. And I've spent some time as a teacher and tutor, and I've tried to explain different things to people. And one of the main things I've learned from my experience in education is the adage that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And at the same time, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And it's like the same thing's true with Bitcoin, with everything it touches. It's like, I've frustrated myself to no end trying to explain, like, guys, it's a cultural revolution. Like, you gotta, like, please read about it. Like, go down the rabbit hole. And they're like, no, I'm busy. I got work. And it's like, okay, I'll talk to you in 3 years or whenever you come around, and it's very frustrating. But, being on this side of it, because it does feel like a side in many ways, it feels like the movement itself is completely inevitable, despite what you or I or anyone else does, or Michael Saylor or Elon Musk. It's almost like it's just circumstantial. Like, it's going to happen. There's going to be a first company, a first country, a first this or that and the other. It's going to happen. And it's like, so how do you handle that? I mean, obviously you have a podcast, and right, you spend your time thinking about it, but like, how do you reconcile it, like, in your own brain, or how do you how do you make peace with it, that the adoption is going to happen at the pace that it happens, and you were just along for the ride? Like, how do you handle that?
Yeah. Well, back to your point about trying to persuade people. I mean, I've pretty much given up on that. Like, if people have questions for me, I'll try to answer them. And I'll certainly share my enthusiasm, because I want to. I don't want to bottle that up, right? I'm happy and hopeful about something, and something that it's so incredibly meaningful that, like, part of my quality of life is being enthusiastic about that. But I stop short of getting too worked up about not being able to persuade people, because there's probably a number of reasons for this, but one is, like, this is a genuine paradigm shift on a lot of different levels, and that's kind of one of the hallmarks of a paradigm shift. Like, you can't see it until you see it, and who knows what the thing is that, like, what makes the shoe drop for you to click and be like, oh, I get it now. Like, I've seen it happen on a number of different levels, be they economic, social, philosophical, spiritual. Like, it happens on every domain. So I don't, and it's almost impossible to know what it's going to be for each person. But that's why so many people still have a hard time appreciating the significance of it and getting it, because they're, it's almost like you're trying to fit a round peg into a square hole, or a square peg into a round hole, right? Like it just doesn't work. So I'm kind of a proponent of, if you think it's meaningful, engage in it, talk about it, do whatever it is that makes you most enthusiastic about it or gives you the most energy. And I think that will attract people over time. And to your point, like you always, nothing is certain, right? So you always want to have that in the back of your mind. But I had this conversation the other night, and you don't get many opportunities in life to really, bet the farm. And I don't mean that just financially. I mean, like, how many things do you even come across that are almost worthy of your total commitment? Like family is probably one of them, being a parent, that kind of thing, but not many others. Like there's not many philosophies or political groups or companies that you can like really totally commit yourself to. And I know it's dangerous. And like I've explored the question before, what happens if this fails? And it would be devastating. There's no doubt about it, because we'd be back to square one where we're like, well, we're back in despair territory now. The future looks a lot different, right? So it would be devastating. But there's something liberating about going all in. There's something liberating about being so certain that what you're doing for the right reasons, and that there's something beautiful about saying, I'm going to go down with the ship, and I'm going to do everything I can to have the ship not go down. But it's kind of like one of those things that's worth sacrificing yourself for in a metaphorical sense, at least, or in a non-fatal sort of sense. And so, in terms of how I think about its inevitability, that's kind of where I'm at. And I do think it'll play out in stages, and we always speculate how it's going to happen. Michael Saylor kind of accelerated the corporate balance sheet aspect of things, because most of us were talking about for years that corporates would kind of dip their toes in the water, and here he comes down and does a big cannonball in the pool. But we as far as the conversations that I've always been having, they have always been characterized by sort of like, when they get it, like, why would they be any different than most of us? Because like when you really get it and you accelerate down the rabbit hole, it's kind of like, holy shit. And it's difficult to put 1% or 5% in if you really have a holy shit moment, So I think it'll start fairly cautiously, but as we say, gradually, then suddenly, I think it could accelerate quite quickly. And, once it gets the media attention, and once it gets the sanction from large corporations and institutions, and once it gets the sanction from, governments that are not really beholden to having their own currency, and therefore may not resist, a sovereign currency like Bitcoin as much, I don't see how the cat stays in the bag very long. Like I think what we're seeing is the time to holy shit is decreasing. So if you came into Bitcoin in 2014, like I did, it was really interesting. I liked it from a libertarian perspective. I was a gold bug before. Like, it made sense on a number of different levels, but I didn't holy shit about it until 2018, really. Like I didn't really like know how big of an impact it would have until then. And then people that came in 2020, whether you're Michael Saylor or you're a random, I've spoken to some people that are just random nobodies on Twitter, and they came in 2020 and they shared their story with me. And their holy shit was very quick, and there's a number of reasons for that. One, Bitcoin's back then it was, let's say, 100 or 200 billion dollar market cap. Now it's $1 trillion. So the social, like that size of a thing, garners less skepticism, right? Because that's a social proof or an economic proof that like this is a real thing. Whereas back in 2014, maybe it was just a few $1 billion. So there wasn't that much economic proof. But the other thing is, as it sucks in more people, and as all those people try to digest what this is, and a lot of people are inspired to write, create content, books, podcasts, visual art, start companies in the space, like it becomes a lot easier to get the information that you need to try to understand it better. You're spoiled for choice. And so these people that are coming in now, they can just pick up a bunch of like the top 3 podcasts and a couple of good articles, and I think they'll get it pretty quickly. So I think that the time to holy shit is decreasing, and that, that's almost scary, because that means this could happen like really fast, and nobody knows how it's going to play out. Of course, I mean, lean towards wanting it to be a more controlled transition, but such things, we don't have a choice about such things, right? And I say that just because things are very precarious right now, and the legacy system has so much pent up turbulence inside of it right now, and I don't even know if a controlled unwind is possible. But the punchline is I hope that as many people as possible can get on the Bitcoin lifeboat before things go to hell. But a lot of people, to your point, are just unaware and uninterested in these concerns. Like most of my peers, where I am right now, they like playing the stock market to make some easy money, but they're not thinking about macro level stability of currency, long-term debt cycles, all that kind of stuff. I mean, they're very much in a narrow scope of their finances and investing. And even other people don't even pay attention to that kind of stuff. They're very much just at the mercy of the economic conditions that they're in. And unfortunately, they don't see the necessity or the importance of understanding it better and maneuvering better to protect themselves or even advance their situation. So, we shall see how it plays out. But that macro narrative is becoming so obvious now. You really have to be not paying attention to or have substantially conflicting interests, like the central bankers and like the gold bugs, to not see it.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it was in your podcast with Michael Saylor back in either November or December, which I just listened to this morning, where you said like the macro narrative is like, it's almost so played out to the point of boredom, something like that. Like, it's so obvious that it's like, if you've been in the space, it's so obvious, but most people aren't in the space. Like to your point, like most people aren't thinking about the macro narrative. They're thinking about work, family, paying the mortgage. Is their retirement account going up? Are they contributing every month? And, they're just, working on their family, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just frustrating because these are like my friends. I've known them, 20 whatever years. And it's like, dude, like you have got to start paying attention to Bitcoin. And it's like, I know you're going to eventually, because you're going to have to. So please now, just start now, because you're going to make little mistakes. You're going to lose your keys, or you're going to, whatever you're going to do. So
but then you're the crazy guy, right? Then you come off like you can only push so hard.
Yeah. So now I don't push. I don't push to specific people anymore. That's the thing. It's like, I'll just put it out there. I'll do a podcast, put it out there. Whoever finds it, finds it. And if it resonates, great. If it's a friend, great. If it's a stranger, great. It doesn't matter. So,
there's a Darwinian component to all this too, as there is to everything, right? And I agree. With compassion in my heart, I want to help family members and friends and anyone who cares to listen, really, because I think I think people are going to need saving in this environment that we're in and moving further into. But it's also the case that, I've characterized Bitcoin as a wealth transfer to the curious, a long time ago. And I like that, right? If our future is the people with capital are those who were curious and who were open-minded, who were critical thinkers and who valued, liberty and freedom and fairness, it could be worse. I think those are some good people to have access to capital, rather than the reverse right now, where it's the people closest to the monetary spigot. And those are politicians who, generally speaking, although I know there are some good people in politics, are narcissistic, are power hungry, are, not necessarily genuine in their interactions with people, have always kind of contorted themselves to fit whatever narrative was required to, come off as someone, to get votes and stuff like that. So I like how what's happening right now is that the rewards are being distributed to honest, genuine, open, intelligent, curious, fair, sort of people. So the silver lining there for the people that we can't convince,
Yeah, no, for sure. And plenty of people talk about the incentives of the fiat system versus the Bitcoin system. I know Robert Breedlove is one. I'm sure you've talked about it. Many people have. But it's like in the fiat system, if you're a politician, you're incentivized to just essentially make promises you can't keep, which means print money. I mean, those are promises. Like a Federal Reserve note is a promise to pay in theory, but in practice, it represents a promise to steal. It's like, I'm gonna keep stealing from you as long as you keep accepting these and holding them. And that's a terrible, terrible incentive. Unlike any asset that you work for, which includes Bitcoin with proof of work, but also even if you're mining actual gold or just any asset that you're building, it's a promise that you're going to keep. It's like, I worked for this, and it's like, I have a vested interest in maintaining the value of this thing, and I'm not going to betray you. Unlike fiat, where it's like, yeah, I'm going to screw you over because like I can't. And because it's so tempting and it's just so rewarding, especially when we're anonymous towards each other, as a politician is to his or her constituents. It's like they don't hang out on the weekend, so they don't have to look each other in the eye and be like, hey man, like what's up with that? They can just say like, well, it was a systemic, my predecessor, we couldn't have seen this, a virus came, who would have thought,
Yeah.
They can't kick the can down the road and point fingers somewhere else. So I mean, the incentives of the fiat system are so like sinister, and something like Bitcoin, like where you work for the asset, the incentives are just so beautiful to build something stable where everyone has an interest in working together. It's beautiful.
Yeah. It is. It really is beautiful. It flips the incentives problem right on its head and corrects all of that kind of stuff. And sinister is the right word, and the thing that staggers, bothers, whatever me, is that people don't even see us, any of what you just talked about how those broken incentives right from the source permeate all the way down and screw up everything. That money printer, the ability to produce money at zero cost, literally gives those people in power a mechanism to feign as though they're able to avoid consequences. But really, as you said, all they're doing is kicking the can down the road. They're amplifying the size of the problem in the future. But hey, it'll be blamed on someone else. I won't be around, whatever the excuse is. Even a lot of them, I don't think politicians are even that aware of what's really broken. They're just playing to their incentives. They're not necessarily aware of their incentives. And it's tragic, and I think it ends up characterizing our culture as one that attempts to avoid consequence everywhere, right? Because if you have the deluded, the delusion of being able to avoid consequences right at the top of the pyramid, I think that permeates and trickles down everywhere else. And so as a culture, and this is part of the reason why, a lot of people in the Bitcoin space would characterize our current times as being very soft, because everywhere where it's easier to avoid consequence and the money printer allows us to trick ourselves into thinking that we're actually able to do that, we take that choice, we take that option. And what we don't recognize is that, again, it's just kicking the can down the road. It's just amplifying a amplifying a small consequence into a greater consequence sometime in the future. But it is not eliminating it or avoiding it in any way, shape, or form. But if you do that, and if people expect that, well, living consequence-free is how you become soft, right? You don't ever have to confront the consequences of your actions. You don't ever have to take full responsibility for the decisions that you make or don't make. And, once you see that, it's understanding Bitcoin, and everyone articulates it in a similar way. It kind of changes how you see everything. It changes your perception on the structure of society and politics and human behavior, and all the way down to the most fundamental aspects of who we are. Again, why I'm so interested in this, what's happening in terms of culture surrounding Bitcoin. And it's bizarre, but you end up, it's like seeing the Matrix. That's the common metaphor. It's like you end up seeing the Matrix for what it is. And a lot of people who aren't down the Bitcoin rabbit hole will think I'm being, arrogant or you know, hyperbolic by characterizing it that way. But that just speaks to how insidious and how ingrained the type of money that a society uses is in how the structures and institutions that emerge around it, be they political, corporate, social, etc. And of course, how that shapes the individuals that participate in that system. And I can't wait for things to flip and for Bitcoin to be the foundation for another system, because I think it'll be, for some, a challenging transition for those who aren't willing to accept responsibility for their decisions, people who aren't willing to accept, some of the difficult choices that emerge from living, who are used to living in a very consequence-free manner, that if, you do something wrong, the government will bail you out or whatever. So it'll be difficult for some, but the types of individuals that I think that will create ultimately are, far more mature, responsible people who understand the consequences of their actions and who therefore are more careful in determining what their actions are going to be. And I think that will foster a far stronger and a far fairer and a far ultimately better society. And we shall see what kind of form it takes. But I'm pretty pumped for it.
Yeah, I'm pretty pumped too. And I'm generally an optimist about everything, even even like when I see like just awfulness, I'm like, well, but there's a way out. There's hope, right? Like hope.
Powerful.
Anyway, something I'm thinking about now as I philosophize as Bitcoiners do is are we? Is it foolish? Is it foolish of me, or is it foolish of anyone to think that Bitcoin is some kind of permanent solution to anything, really? I mean, you can kind of like fill in the blank, a solution to whatever, or is it just circumstantial of the inevitable cycles of ups and downs, maybe like a fourth turning kind of thing? Because obviously there's going to be some dark period in the future, somewhat similar to the dark period we had now, or the dark ages, or anything. So is it foolish to think that Bitcoin is a permanent solution, or is it not? Is it actually a solution to something kind of forever? I mean, what do you think?
I mean, forever is a long time. So I tend to think of these things as, well, I think it's an evolution, right? And I think Bitcoin, I look at it in terms of how much room to run does Bitcoin have until we kind of bump up against its ceiling and the cracks begin to emerge, right? We start kind of exceeding its capacity to perform the function that we have designed it to perform. And don't get me wrong, like I think Bitcoin, we're in a historical period where it's more challenging than ever to project out 100 years, right? With artificial intelligence and all the stuff that's going on, who knows? But I do think Bitcoin has a long room to run. Like if we're able to maintain its fundamental attributes, right? One of the most fundamental being 21 million, then because of its nature as software, ultimately, that we can upgrade it, right? We can work with it. We can implement things into it to allow for certain functionality that we may want. But I feel like it would be a little bit naive to say it's. I mean, all of this is an evolution, right? But then again, this is where it gets tricky, because if Bitcoin is kind of like the incorruptible substance, right? If it's like kind of an alchemical substance, and this will be very esoteric to most people, but if have we created that as humanity, right? Like, is this a turning point where we've actually developed something that can kind of resist our malice and corruption, while also performing, the roles for coordination and cooperation, et cetera, that we wanted to create? And if we've done that, and if we've done it in a way that continues to be incorruptible, then that thing could, be a wellspring of a lot of things for a long time. Now, and it's been said before, I think Saylor said it, like gold was a dumb rock. And, as human ingenuity increased, its ability to serve its purpose decreased, right? Because we could find ways around it, basically. We could find ways to corrupt it. Whereas something like software that is inherently upgradable, our ingenuity can actually amplify its utility rather than detract from it. And that's an interesting notion. How long that holds up. The real question here is, I guess, with everything, how able is anything? How capable is any substance or system in resisting our tendency to corruption, resisting our desire to find a shortcut, whether that be an individual or a group of people or whatever. Like, that's the real question in my mind. Will we corrupt this thing? Because I guess in theory it's corruptible, but in Bitcoin, it there's no incentive to corrupt it. Or there's, let's put it this way. I guess the bet is that the incentive not to corrupt it is larger and more powerful than the incentive to corrupt it. Because you could make a case like a nation state, like the US government may have an incentive to corrupt it. But if you're an individual and you're an honest individual and you just want to, improve your situation and save money for the future and enhance and foster cooperation and exchange and trade and that kind of stuff, I think it's one of the first systems or it's the best system yet at aligning all the incentives of the participants involved. And as a result, is that what staves off the corrupting, our corrupt nature, or the element of our nature that is corrupt? And if that's the case, then I think it could prosper for a long time and could really be even, as much as we like to speculate about how beneficial that could be for human flourishing, I think we're all probably underestimating it if that's the case, if it really is that thing, that thing that we won't corrupt. So we shall see.
Yeah, we'll see. It's so big. And I think like you and many Bitcoiners, I'm so excited for the next couple decades, whatever the time period is when we, where it does finally go exponential in terms of adoption and that sort of thing. And we just build this amazing world on top of it with, smart technologies and whatever other like derivative kind of cryptos or businesses or services, whatever are built on top of it. It's going to be incredible. We're all going to have flying drone helicopters, or whatever it is. Like, it's going to be amazing. But I'm already thinking past that, just because it's fun. To the next time we come down, and maybe Bitcoin is corruptible. So let me brainstorm some scenarios with you and just see what you think. One is similar to like all the altcoins we've seen fork from Bitcoin, like Bitcoin Cash and BSV and all these, which are silly. I think most of us would agree. But they were attempts at improving Bitcoin, quote unquote, improving. And I think it's possible. I have no idea how likely. I have no idea when, but I would say many, many, many decades from now, if ever, it's possible that a majority of people who are running Bitcoin nodes and who are mining Bitcoin try to improve Bitcoin in such a way, as we improve software, that they think is genuinely better, whatever that means for the time. And it results in, the equivalent of a Federal Reserve, you might say, of the Bitcoin space, where, okay, we had great money for 120, 130 years. Now let's improve it, by whatever tweaks to the code we all, or a majority of us, want to run, and we all implement this new updated software, and then it somehow creates some incentive that Satoshi wouldn't have created, and the developers of the 2010s and maybe 2020s wouldn't have created, but the developers of the 2060s or the 2070s might just think something's better and get it wrong. Who knows? That's one scenario. I haven't thought too much about it. It kind of just came to me. What do you think?
Well, I think because Bitcoin is going to be upgraded and stewarded all along that time. Like, I think those new developers that come in with their ideas will probably be drawn into Bitcoin and work on it rather than work on a competitor. But in theory, it's totally possible. But the thing is that unlike the Federal Reserve, if that were to happen, people can freely choose which version of Bitcoin or which digital currency they want to use. So if in 2060 someone comes out with Doge 2.0 or Bitcoin Superman or whatever, the market will find the truth. The market will determine which one is the best. And it can only do that if people are freely able to choose. And this is the point about all of this. It's like we live in a system where bad money is forced on us through legal tender laws, right? And it is such a tyrannical system. It really is. And people will hear me use that word and they'll think, come on, man, we live in Canada, we live in the US, we live in the UK, like we're the freest people there ever were and stuff like that. And I'm like, first of all, I don't know if that's necessarily true. There's certainly pockets of societies in the past that were probably more free. And if Alex Svetsky had a great piece read by Guy Swan a couple of days ago. Can't remember the name of it, but he said, imagine you're in a relationship, and then he listed out, the different attributes of this relationship. So like, you have to tell them how much money you have, and you have to give them 40% of the money that you make, and you have to announce your arrival if you want to leave the house or leave the jurisdiction, and like all these things that we are forced to do in the modern world of nation states. And when you put it in plain language like that, you go, oh my God, like how far we've come from being free human beings able to make our own choices. So that's the critical distinction that I think Bitcoin will open the door to that. I think Bitcoin is going to shrink the nation state. Bitcoin is going to do away with central banking eventually. We'll see how long it takes. And we'll be in an environment where there's a lot more freedom of choice. And in that environment, that's where the truth finding mechanism of the market really gets to flourish, because we've really pounded that into submission at this stage, in the modern world, through all this funny money creation, through the manipulation of interest rates, through all this government intervention in markets, price controls and malinvestment and redistributions and all this kind of stuff. We've really neutered the market's ability to find truth. When market participants are more ably and unobstructedly capable of making choices for themselves, and the fidelity of the signals that they're using to make those choices, i.e. the price signal, is almost perfect rather than incredibly noisy and diluted as it is today, then whatever choice the markets make will be the truth, will be the best. So if these developers in 2060 launch this new coin, I have a full faith that the market will be able to determine whether that's better at performing the functions of money, or if Bitcoin is better at performing the functions of money. And I'm perfectly happy with the outcome of if it is better, then capital will flow out of Bitcoin into that thing. And if it's not, it won't. But I think Bitcoin has a lot of characteristics that serve as a pretty strong moat. The way that it launched being one of them. I think it would be exceedingly hard to fairly launch a new coin today without it being, gamed or corrupted in some kind of a way. So I think the most likely scenario is that Bitcoin is stewarded, by the users, the people that run nodes, the development community, the investment community, all that kind of stuff. And hopefully I think it's stewarded properly, that it maintains its dominance at that time. But anything can happen. So that's what makes it exciting, right? You make a call, you make a bet, and we'll see. There's so much to be excited about now. Like, I feel like getting Bitcoin over the line and kind of engaging in this phenomenon and celebrating it and being enthusiastic about it is the way to go. Because there's so many people, and you probably have, spoken to them or at least aware of them, a lot of older generation people, gold bugs or traditional investors and stuff. it's almost like they don't allow themselves to believe that something so good has emerged. They're almost so jaded by the environment that they've had to operate in for so long. They're just like, it can't be. So because it can't be, I'm going to assume it's something totally different. And I admit, like, I think that's a hurdle a lot of us have to cross to really appreciate what this is, because especially if you had a concern for the world prior, and if you really tried to understand what was going on, and if you do that in earnest, at least my opinion is that you see a lot of the corruption and malice and the results of both incompetence and malevolence in the world. It can be difficult to even imagine that something that dissolves away a lot of those problems, reorients people to maximally avoid them, and that could usher in a genuine Renaissance 2.0, far greater than the original. That can be, ironically, something difficult to believe in. I mean, we almost are conditioned to keep ourselves in a very closed-minded sort of state about what's possible, both for our own personal lives and for society and the world at large. But if, again, back to the curious, open-minded people, if you're one of those people that you, at least for the sake of the exercise, allow yourself to be open to the possibility that something could be way better and that a solution to solve a lot of these problems could now exist, and you shelve or you pause your skepticism, not even your skepticism, you pause your disbelief just long enough to learn as much as you can about this thing, then I think what happens is the more you learn, the more that disbelief turns into belief. And, that's why the rabbit hole is so intoxicating, because you're both trying to poke holes in it, and you're also trying to understand the significance of what it represents if it's true. And those two things going, a mile a minute down the rabbit hole, you end up coming to the conclusion that, like, this thing may very well be real. And I'm not going to limit myself in thinking what it could be, because I want to participate in it as much as I can. And so I want to believe in the possibility, because that's what brings things about. Believing that something is possible is step one at actually making something possible. So, I think that's why, dreamers have always played an important role in society. And I guess, there's an element of that in people that are grokking and adopting Bitcoin now.
Yeah, big time. And it's like, I see the ways that some people dream, and not to put them down, but it does seem it's like dreaming with a ceiling, like their dreams are, instead of making, 65,000 a year, if only I could make 85,000. And it's like, that's your dream, like, what about, like, what if I didn't have to work anymore? Like, what if, like, what I mean? Like, just,
or what if I could wake up and do whatever it is that I really found meaningful and enjoyed? Because my guess is, like, in this society today, work has become so gross and so soul destroying for a lot of people that your dream is to have enough money that you don't have to do it. But what I'm thinking is going to happen, and I'm starting to notice this in the Bitcoin community, a lot of people are becoming financially stable or independent, right? They may not have to, quote unquote, work anymore. One, they want to continue to stack sats because they know how valuable they're going to be in the future. So there's an opportunity cost of not working. But the other thing is, like, it gives you this clarity of mind to say, okay, like, I'm not on the hamster wheel anymore. I don't need, like, I'm not furiously trying to make enough so that I don't have to work anymore. What resonates with me? Like, what do I find meaningful? What do I want to do? And I think we're seeing people in the community start up these small businesses or engage in these hobbies that they find really meaningful. And slowly but surely, maybe they turn into a business, or maybe they turn into something else. But, like, I think we want to engage in meaningful, productive work. I really do think as human beings, we want to do that. It gives us a sense of purpose. But we've just been conditioned, because of the system we're in, to want to be done work forever and not have to work and have enough money not to, just to sit on the beach and sip, pina coladas or something. I think that's a perversion of behavior. I really think that Bitcoiners are going to be highly productive people, in a hyper Bitcoinized world. It's just going to be that they're going to have the freedom to be productive in the things that they believe are the most meaningful or enjoyable, for them.
Yeah, the beautiful thing, there's a quote by Gandhi: happiness is when what you think, what you say, and what you do are in harmony.
Yeah, I
And
love
like,
that one.
oh man, it's so good. And like when I saw it, I was working in a job that was a soul sucking job, and I was like, well, that's why I'm not happy. It's because I believe
Yeah,
certain things about the world, and yet I'm doing these other things every day for a paycheck. And it was just like ripping me apart inside. And it wasn't until I quit the job and like took some time off that like I started to get happy again. And it's like, okay, I can live according to my own values. And
exactly. That's exactly it. And that's why when we talk about how there'll be a different morality will pervade society as a result of being on a different monetary standard, people are like, what are you talking about? Like, people think of themselves as like, uh, in a vacuum almost. Like, I think the way I think, I believe the way I believe, I act the way I act, irrespective of my surroundings, which is absolutely crazy. We're nothing but creatures that take in stimulus from our environment and integrate it into ourselves and then put it back out into our environment in a never-ending process of doing that. So our environment is incredibly important in shaping us, much as we may try to both think objectively. But I think that's the case. Like, how I don't think people appreciate how much it corrupts you, ethically and morally and spiritually, to willingly and knowingly do things that you either don't enjoy or that you don't agree with, or or even in some cases that you think are wrong. But hey, it's given social sanction. It's a job, and nobody, it's legal, quote unquote, and it pays the bills, and nobody's giving me shit for it, and I actually get to go out and do some fun stuff with the proceeds of doing it. And like, I think we'll look back in hindsight and explore how much doing that corrupted people's morality in different areas of their life, and stymied any sort of spiritual connection, and how much that'll be reversed when they don't have to do that. When they and it speaks to what we were talking about earlier about the consequences of your choices. Like, you can go work at a job which is probably not doing good work, or maybe it conflicts with your beliefs in some way, but it's gotten social sanction and it pays the bills, so you do it. You're able to avoid the consequence of you doing something that is not in alignment with who you are, because it's in alignment with the broader cultural narrative or value set or principles. And so you're able to avoid that consequence of going against your own morality or what you think is good. And so again, there we have that instantiation of avoidance of consequences. And I think in a Bitcoin system, that'll be flipped, and you will be held more accountable, both to yourself and by the system and your community and the culture, or if you engage in things that are not in alignment with what you think is right, or your principles or your values.
yeah, it's so true. And I like your point about, or the phrase you use, social sanction. I haven't heard that phrase, and it's so true that people do so many things like at work because they have a bunch of colleagues who do it, or just the media rewards it, or it's an okay thing to say that you're this type of job, you do this for a living, people approve of it. And yeah, that bit about avoiding consequences, it's like, yeah, okay, if you work a job, there's positive financial consequences, probably positive social consequences, but I would say like negative spiritual consequences. Like, I think, and that, I mean, I was not spiritual for many, many years of my life, and then it sort of happened over time. And so now I would consider myself spiritual for sure. But since I neglected it for so long, it's almost like I have a spiritual debt that I somehow need to pay off, if that makes any sense. And I think a lot of people are incurring like a large spiritual debt. So what is your spirituality? I'm sure it's grown throughout your time in Bitcoin, but do you mind talking about how it evolved like throughout your life, maybe before Bitcoin even, and then in your Bitcoin time?
Sure. It's a word with a lot of baggage, so it's difficult to find the right words to talk about this subject matter. But I get, I was always curious. So I even when I was in high school, like I remember studying I'm particularly interested in the Eastern philosophies and religions at that time, so I was looking at Buddhism and Taoism and Hinduism and that kind of stuff. And it resonated with me more, I think, and it didn't have the cultural baggage of like the dark side of Christianity throughout our history, like in the Inquisition and that kind of stuff. So maybe it was more appealing to me for that reason. But I'd always just kind of said, like, there's no way of knowing, God or what's really at play here. So I'm not really, I don't put that much stock in people that claim to know anything about it. But I appreciate people that have speculated, and said, like, these are my thoughts, and these philosophies seem to have some application in life pragmatically and that kind of stuff. And that led me into the psychedelic realm, in my early 20s, and going down into the Amazon for a while, and doing several ayahuasca sessions on 2 different occasions, just because I was just exceedingly curious about what's going on with consciousness, and of course the larger questions. And I don't know if that provided any answers, but it certainly expanded the territory. It certainly changes your perception of what consciousness is and how vast it is. There's definitely, it definitely seems as though there's either a universe inside our consciousness, or we're able to access a universal consciousness, one or the other. I don't know which it is. And of course, I guess it could be both in some roundabout way. But so that's kind of my spirituality. It's like I don't adhere to a specific religious faith. I've been listening to a lot over the last 2 or 3 years of Jordan Peterson's work. His book, Maps of Meaning, I thought was phenomenal. A really great framework for, kind of understanding the role of religious myth and story throughout history, and certainly gave me a greater appreciation for them. And then his biblical series on YouTube and his podcast have opened my eyes to a lot of the wisdom contained in those stories. And it begs the question, where does your morality come from? Because I might be able to say, look, I don't know. I think there's something larger than ourselves. I think there's a force that brings order to the universe, because here we are, DNA and human beings and the order of nature and the cycles of time and the universe and galaxies. Like, there appears to be some kind of ordering force. But I can't imply intent into that ordering force, nor anthropomorphize it anyway or anything, So I try to live by not an overt set of principles, but I try to be a good person, and I won't dig into what that means for me, but it does beg the question, like, well, how the fuck do you know what a good person is? And we pick up social cues, and we read these stories, and I think it partially comes from that, right? Like we kind of, our social environment to a certain degree parameterizes our what we believe is good. But again, that's the problem when the society becomes corrupted, as we've been discussing, because it can give you false signals about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's good, what's not good. And there's a lot of different eras in history where those social parameters have led people down a very dark and wrong path to tragic consequences, right? So you can't over rely on the social cues for your morality. And then you say, okay, well, these religious stories, what are they trying to convey? What are they trying to tell us about, morality? And you can say, yeah, they've got some interesting insights. And like, the further you dig into, what they actually mean, you're like, oh, wow, that's really, really interesting. But again, from what authority do they speak? And I think that's part of the reason, be careful here with my language, but I think that's why they have to invoke the idea of God in order for all the stories and philosophies and teachings below them to take on a gravity and relevance. Because if not, how are they grounded in a truth that you will believe enough to integrate into your life, to allow to become part of you? So, those are 2 components of it, but I still think they're incomplete. So I don't know. I don't know where our idea of good comes from. But, Jordan Peterson has said before, if you ask yourself a question, your internal mind will usually give you an answer right away. Like if you're confronted with something and you say, should I do this? Usually you'll get a pretty quick and definitive answer from your internal dialogue. The trick is, are you gonna listen to it? And again, this is the problem, man. Like we go back to that discussion about engaging in work that you find soul destroying. It's like, do I want to do this job? No, but I need the money, or I want the money, or I want the status, or I want whatever. So I'm going to do it. So I feel like in today's society, we've, from a very young age, probably, but certainly reinforced over time as an adult, you're just conditioned to ignore your inner voice, for some other rationalization. And I think that's probably a mistake. And I think that probably leads to unhappiness on an individual level, and a lack of meaning and nihilism and all that kind of stuff on an individual level. And then, of course, feeding into the broader culture of people who are frustrated, anxious, melancholy, depressed, emotionally have emotional issues, a lack of spirituality, because, and perhaps ultimately because they don't even trust themselves. This might be interesting. I've never explored this before, but one of the things that I always wanted to engage with reality. I know that sounds weird, but so I never lied as a kid, like even from a very young age. And the reason was not so much that I considered myself a saint, or even that I considered lying to be wrong, although I kind of did, but that wasn't the driving factor. For me, I was always so curious about the world, broadly speaking. So I wanted to know as much as I could about it all. And I felt that a lie created a false reality. And I didn't want to be complicit in creating a false reality, because that would make my job of engaging the world truthfully and understanding the world in as truthful a manner as I could more difficult, not to mention, for other people as well. And if everyone's just creating all these false realities through their lies, then how the fuck are we ever going to get to a sense of truth about who we are and what the world is? And, the best and funniest example of this is, I came home drunk one night when I was like way too young. I was drinking in the park with my friends when I was like 14 years old. And I'm not a saint, right? Like I won't offer up the bad things that I did when I was a kid, right? But if I got caught, and this was an example that I came home late, my mom was still up, and she was like, "Smells like you've been drinking." And I just said, "Yes, I've been drinking. I'm tired, and I'm not thinking clearly right now. If it's okay with you, I'd like to go to bed, and we can have this conversation in the morning," right? And she was like, "Okay." So, I went to bed and woke up in the morning. I got grounded, or got the talk about the dangers of, doing what I was doing. And I say all that just because because the question was like, what is your spirituality? And I think that's a super hard question to answer. And it's probably multifaceted, but I do think one of the elements for me was like the concern and journey toward truth is probably one that characterizes mine the most. And like, I don't know what the are, but I do believe that you can continually get closer to them, or gain a better appreciation on your way toward them. And that may be enough. And for me, engaging with truth is the path to do that, because anything else, by definition is untrue, is illusion, is that kind of thing. And the other thing I mentioned was, I think I started to say that one of the reasons why I think that's the fact that our modern sociocultural structure has conditioned people to maybe, or disincentivize them to do something similar, to kind of give up on their conviction around truth and just follow the herd, as it were, is because when life gets really difficult, when you're confronted with difficult situations or catastrophe or whatever, as presumably we all will or do at some point in life. If you've been living a life where you've avoided contending with the truth, or you just willfully been complacent about the truth and not really cared about it, and Jordan Peterson discusses this a lot, but will you be able to trust yourself in the dark night of the soul sort of moment, right? Like and to me the answer is no for most people. If you've always just kind of taken the easy road, the consequence-free road, the avoiding confrontation with reality and not seeking truth, I don't know that you'd have enough faith in yourself to see yourself through the most difficult and challenging times that you might encounter. Whereas I think if you've always been as honest as possible with yourself, and you've tried to perceive and engage the highest form of truth about reality and who you are in that reality as you can, then I think that might just give you, the faith in yourself to weather the stormy seas, as it were. And so that, I guess that's part of the reason why it's been somewhat of a North Star for me, in my relationship to whatever spirituality actually means.
Yeah, I love it. It's beautiful. And mine's similar. I probably would have described it along a very different path, but maybe arrived at the same conclusion of like, it's basically truth, like just trying to find truth. But yeah, very, very different path to get there. But it seems like in the end, it's the same path.
How did you get there?
Oh, well, I guess I'd start by saying I was raised Catholic. So I went to Sunday school, or which I think it was like a Monday school or a Wednesday school or something like that, but same idea. And a lot of it just seemed so contrived, all the stories of the Bible, and this character he's a shepherd and he does this and he says this. I'm like, what are we doing here? Like, it just didn't resonate with me. I didn't know that word at the time, resonate, but it just seemed really contrived. And so I because so much of it was contrived, I sort of dismissed all of it as like a package deal. Like, I don't really think this is for me, this whole religion thing. And by the time I got to college, in my freshman year, I took an elective, which was called Conflicts in Science and Religion. And I thought, okay, this is cool. And it was co-taught by a scientist and a priest. And they both taught every class together. And they would just bring up yeah, it's so cool. And they just would bring up a topic like, what is morality, or like, what's right and wrong. And we would talk about it. And there was maybe 20 or 30 kids in the class, enough that we could all get to know each other. And it was so interesting. And like, kind of the end result of the class was like, the only absolute truth is that there are no absolute truths. And like, that's just sort of like what we got to. And it's like, okay, enjoy your summer break, like, it's like,
Can I have a refund, please?
yeah, right. I was like, what's the meaning of life? So I spent a lot of college as like an atheist. I'm like, there's no way. There's just no way. Like, I can't rationalize it. I can't find like a reasonable, rational argument for God. And anyone I challenge, my peers, it's like they couldn't articulate it well. And I'm like, see, you're wrong. There is no God, right? And it was really childish the way I approached it. And then just eventually, I don't know if there was like a moment or if it was just like a combination of things, but eventually I started to realize that like, there's not really coincidences. It's like there's some like guiding force or hand. And, again, I don't want to anthropomorphize or say like, he or, some guys controlling it, but like there's something going on. And I'm like, this is not all a coincidence. And I've just too many coincidences for it to really be coincidences. There's something else. And once I realized actually that you can't give a rational argument for why rational arguments are better than anything else. Once I realized that, I was like, oh, yeah, a rational argument is just one tool in a toolbox, but you could just act impulsively and you could go through your whole life just doing whatever feels right. And that's just as good. It's just as true. And like this idea of like, well, if I can, argue my way through something that is better than someone who can't, I'm like, that's an illusion. I'm lying to myself. And so like when I sort of peeled that away, I realized like anything could be true. Like there could be a God, there could be two gods, there could be 100 gods. There's something. And so it's like,
Mhm.
I am just a curious person. I just want to know the truth. And one thing I think I've concluded, but maybe I'm wrong, is that you can't really know for sure that you've found truth. You can only really highly convince yourself that something is a lie. Like you can be like pretty sure that things are lies and pretty
Mm.
sure that things are untruthful, but like you can't really prove something to be true. It's just like I haven't proved it false yet. That's sort of how I look at it. What do you think?
Well, there's some quote by someone. I'm not sure if it's like Sherlock Holmes or Albert Einstein or something. I think it might be Sherlock Holmes or something. But it's like once you eliminate the impossible, then what remains is the truth, or something like that, like via a process of eliminating that which is clearly false. I like that way of thinking, and I agree. Like I said before, it seems sensible to me to think that there's an order to reality, because again, here we are, and it seems like many things are highly ordered. And I think the crux of the religious impulse is just to align with the order of reality in the most optimal or beneficial way. And again, because we are what we are, we anthropomorphize and say, okay, well, that ordering principle of reality is God. And throughout our history of observing ourselves and our behavior, and the individual and social behaviors that are most successful, we infer that God rewards certain behavior because those behaviors seem to be beneficial in both the individual and the social domains. So that would be the exact same thing as saying there's an order to reality, and the degree to which you align with that order, you will experience success. Now, of course, that brings in the question like, well, don't people define success differently? And like what makes one person happy may not make another person happy. And that is true, but I think that is kind of the purpose of these archetypal stories, is in saying like, having observed ourselves for millennia, this is kind of what bubbled to the top as like the best, the thing to be striving for the most, or the thing that delivers the most happiness or fulfillment or meaning, just by a process of observing. And so I think that certainly seems reasonable to me. And I think that's why, when you say something like, when you talk about coincidences, to me, that knocks at the door of just being more closely aligned with that ordering principle of reality, or principles, like the ordering force of reality. And it winks at you in certain ways. It's just like, oh yeah, there you go. Like you're on the path. And I think that's really cool. I mean, what could be more interesting than that? And I don't, I honestly think the atheist point of view is just really lazy. And I was that way in, even though I was interested in like Eastern philosophies and stuff, like I was like, well, we die and it's blackness and whatever, the worms eat us and who cares? But I just think that is way too simple. Like it's not appreciating a lot of other stuff, and it's yeah, I think it's lazy. So yeah, I don't know if I have much more to add on that one, but I that's what it seems like to me. So I guess part of the quest is trying to align yourself with that force, that ordering principle, and living life in a manner that helps you illuminate the way in figuring out what that thing is. But I think where we've fallen down in large part in culture, and both the religious phenomenon and just the day-to-day social phenomenon illustrates this, is we've separated ourselves from a lot of this stuff. Like we've turned these stories that were meant to kind of tell us about ourselves, they've been anthropomorphized and maybe lost to, the meaning lost to such a degree that we've made everything material and explicit, and prescriptive. Like we think a lot of these things, like people are claiming that a lot of these things actually happened, and like the devil is something that you or an entity you don't want to encounter, and God is like an entity that you do want to encounter, and Jesus was someone who was born and lived, and like I see them far more as just all aspects of ourselves, and maybe that's part of the point in understanding what that ordering force of reality is that we can embody all of, I mean, that's the domain, that's the range of the experience that we're able to have. And so, and again, like the fact that that's the range, like that we can be the devil, or we can be the saint, or we can be the regenerative hero. How does that not speak to the structure of reality? Because like it could be a totally different set of things that we could be and feel and act, right? But it's not, it's those things. And so the fact that it's those things, can we not infer some things about how reality is structured, that those are the things we're able to feel, think, and do in the reality we find ourselves in? And so is it not somewhat rational to deal with those very things as the religious stories and myths do, and not just do away with them because you think they're old superstitions about people trying to explain the natural processes of the world? Again, I think that's like, one, super lazy, and two, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I don't know. It's super fascinating subject matter. I love to think about. And in fact, I picked up this book just this week on Amazon.
The Origins and History of Consciousness. Okay, nice.
Yeah, it's by Erich Neumann, who was a student of Carl Jung's. So, lots of questions, but I guess it speaks to the thing, like if you've got to enjoy the process of asking the questions, right? Because as your teacher said, or your two professors said, you may forever be starved of definitive answers. So you better enjoy the journey.
Yeah, big time. And have you let me my brain's going too fast. Do you know Mickey Singer? He wrote The Surrender Experiment and The Untethered Soul.
No.
Okay, wow. The Surrender Experiment is like, wow, mind blowing. I don't know if we have time to go like super into it, but I'm rereading it now for the third time on Audible because he narrates it himself, and it is so powerful to hear it in his own voice. And it's sort of like, it's basically his autobiography of him just surrendering to the flow of the universe and really not caring about his personal preferences. Like, oh, I don't feel like, doing that today. But, someone came and knocked on the door and said, hey, let's go do it. And so he just kind of surrenders and says like, all right, let's do it. So anyway, I don't know if I'm doing it justice because it's so profound. And he did this for 40 years, and he, went in the woods to meditate and all these crazy things. He ended up starting a company that he didn't even want to, and it became a publicly traded company, and he got hundreds of millions of dollars and like donated. I mean, like crazy things happened to him, and he didn't plan any of it. It's so bizarre. It's beautiful. It's spiritual. And the reason I mention it now is because he taught a class. Actually, he became a professor at a community college, not his goal, but he surrendered to it because someone asked him to do it. So he said, sure, I'll teach some classes. And he didn't plan the lectures. He just walked in day one and said, okay, who's here? Who's in the room? What are we going to talk about? And he just talked. And his class grew, and people enrolled, or people came to the class who weren't enrolled, I should say. And, this happened in the 1970s. And, the course ended up taking the path of looking at physics, philosophy, religion, all these different things. And he sort of built his thesis around the fact that, or the belief, or the possibility that all these different branches of study are really just pursuing truth. And it's the same truth. It's just different angles of looking at the same truth. And that was just sort of like the thesis, or the direction that his class took organically without him trying to do it. And I think he wrote his PhD dissertation on that very topic, I believe. And, then the rest is history, I guess. So like just crazy cool stuff. And it just made me think of it now when you're describing all that.
Yeah, I'll look into his stuff, but it does kind of speak to that notion, and I can't. I'm sure there's been many quotes about it, but something about seeing God in all things. You kind of like the divine aspect, or truth, or however we characterize it. You know, is represented maybe necessarily due to the fact that they exist in all things, and your ability to, if not see that, but to appreciate that maybe that's the case, changes your relationship to reality in many ways, and how you interact with reality, and how you respect it and respect yourself, and that kind of stuff. And one final point about what we've been talking about, because of that, what we've both just articulated, it speaks to the importance, because a lot of people, especially the very materialistic view, have a very easy time, or perhaps they unavoidably kind of dismiss the importance of their own actions. It's like, I'm just a drop in the sea, one of 8 billion. It doesn't really matter what I do. It's inconsequential, whatever. And I think, if we're all subject to the same processes of creation and existence, and that interplay between the fabric of the forces and fabric of reality, and us, like we're not separate from it, but we do influence it, and it influences us, again, I think necessarily because we exist. Then I think our behavior does matter. Like, what we do and what we say actually feeds into the experience of reality for obviously ourselves, but everyone else too. Like, we're kind of creating being every breath we take. And I think it matters in the extreme how we treat that process, and in my opinion, how we treat that privilege. But this does circle back to Bitcoin, actually, because as everything ultimately does. But I think it's important because Bitcoin is allows you to be sovereign over your sacrifice, right? The choices that you have made that have netted you capital, right? That people have valued the sacrifices that you have made, and they've rewarded you for them, and allows you to retain them in a sovereign way yourself, without anybody able to intermediate that relationship. But it also gives you an avenue to express who you are with full fidelity. Like, if we accept that human beings are in a divine relationship with the force of reality, the ordering force of reality, and I think that's my impression, then how we communicate ourselves is of the utmost importance. And so that means that, of course, how you act and how you speak is important, because that is an outward expression of who you are, but also how you express yourself economically, because for most people, that's the primary method of how they express themselves. Most people aren't doing podcasts on a daily basis and getting into these long discussions about who they are, but their behavior, as represented in their economic transactions, is a representation of who they are. Fundamentally, I mean, someone's buying and their shopping tells you a lot more about them than what they say about themselves. And so, to the extent that the mechanism by which you express those economic wants, if that mechanism has an intermediary, if there's more noise in that signal, i.e., from someone else debasing your currency, affecting the price, the signal that you're sending by interrupting the fidelity of the currency you're using, then your expression is not being communicated with 100% fidelity. Like, there's distortion in your expression. So what you are and what you're communicating to the market, there's distortion there. That's meaning that the market's not getting the full communication of who and what you are. And so if we're using this line of reasoning that we are fundamentally shaped and in a relationship with the ordering principle of reality, and that actually matters for reality, then how that's expressed to others with whom we're engaging with is very, very important. And Bitcoin allows that to be done in the highest fidelity way that we've ever seen, with the least amount of distortion, with the greatest genuineness of expression to the market of the behavior that we're actually representing, and by extension, who we actually are.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, it's so powerful. I've actually believed that for several years. I can't remember if I started to form that belief before or after I got into Bitcoin, but I do believe that, everyone's example matters of everything you do all day long, like your speech, the way, what you choose to do for a living, your attitude about everything and so forth. Not that it's easy, but just that it matters. And the importance of being conscious about what you choose to do and say, and where you put your money and your time and your energy and so forth. It's so powerful. And I've started to believe, connecting this to spirituality, I've started to believe that God, to the extent that God exists, because language is pretty limiting, but God is in all of us. I don't know if that's the Holy Spirit or what it is, but when I see somebody else, I'm like, there's God in that person. There's God in that person. And sometimes they're honoring the God in themselves, and sometimes they're not. And likewise myself, sometimes I'm faithful or to that, or sometimes I'm not. And of course, our economic transactions are so important in terms of, putting your money where your mouth is, you might say, or where your values are. But in terms of everything else too, because your energy is your value. It's your money, like your energy, your attention. It's like what you choose to focus on, like all these different things, like that's your money, that's your value.
Mm-hmm.
Like are more so than, your dollars or your Bitcoin are. It's so powerful, because even if your dollars and your Bitcoin go away, it's like you're still you. Like you're a person, and like you're either, you're going to wake up in the morning and you're going to do whatever, or you're going to do something else. And there's that quote that your net worth is what you'd be worth if you lost all your money. Like that's your net worth. It's like if all your money was gone, what are you? What are you to the world? And I think it connects really nicely to what you and Michael Krieger were talking about on your recent episode of, I think it was in the context of spiral dynamics, which I had never heard of until he mentioned it, but like sort of like level 1 and level 2 consciousness, sort of some people going through the world trying to get stuff for themselves, and others who go through the world trying to give stuff away and serve and share and provide. And so I think I want to live in a world where everyone is just like giving things away all the time. Like that's so beautiful. It's just like, yeah, here I made whether it's I made a casserole, here all my neighbors, here sharing this, or here I made this awesome software project, here you go world, or just whatever it is. I want to live in that world. And so like
I think you would see that, with people not in such a state of deprivation and scarcity. I think you would see a lot more generosity of that kind, because people are, and you do already, like, wealthy people tend to be very giving, especially to other wealthy people, whether that's out of respect or trying to carry favor or whatever. But I think once, and, I want to be careful not to bleed into the socialist mindset here, because I believe that's a false sense of abundance. And so I think it ultimately fosters more behavior born out of scarcity and deprivation. But when people have, a confidence and security over themselves and their family and their finances, I do think they're generally, more generous. And I think they would be, especially to the degree of sovereignty and financial independence that Bitcoin provides. And to your previous point, I totally agree with the way you characterized, how everyone has a divine essence, and, recognizing that in yourself and trying to recognize that in others, and acting in a manner that respects that is probably the quote unquote spiritual path. And so many people these days, again, because I think there's this habit of separating yourself almost from everything, that people use their dogmatic religious faith as a crutch, and then go off and do all sorts of behaviors that are not in line with the faith, nor in line with what I'm sure, push comes to shove, they would agree is right. But they kind of compartmentalize and say, well, I go to church on Sunday and I preach the virtues of this faith, and then I go off and do this stuff, and that allows them to perform the mental gymnastics to, again, avoid the consequence of the truth of your actions, avoid having to confront the real implications of your action, both for yourself and for other people. So yeah, I agree with what you said there.
Yeah, cool. So we probably don't have too much time left, but I do want to ask you about thinking about our place in the cosmos and imagining the future. Extraterrestrials. I've spent certain periods of my life, watching every documentary I could and so forth, and I haven't much lately. But I just can't help but think of it in this conversation, and bizarrely, especially in the context of Bitcoin, and imagining how it might end one day, 50, 100 years or something. I imagine extraterrestrials will have something to do with it. People are going to tune out here, but what is your thought on the whole extraterrestrial question, and what kind of role do you think that'll play in human civilization, if any?
I mean, it seems highly unlikely for all intents and purposes, infinite universe, that there's not other life, right? The same processes that gave rise to us must be able to occur, or must have occurred, in probably many, many, many other places. Now, are we even within the same, are we close enough to ever come in contact with them? I guess there's no real way of knowing. And are we on the same time scale? Who knows? I think we all like to think that we will, make contact. I don't know why we want to think that. Like, if we show up on their doorstep, maybe that's a more favorable outcome for us. If they show up on our doorstep, I mean, we know how things worked out when the Europeans arrived in America, right? It's kind of the alien invasion of that the only parallel that we really have, those types of situations. And those haven't always worked out well. Will they be more advanced or enlightened or something like that? Who knows? So, but I tend to think they exist. The interesting question, especially as far as our conversation has been going, is like, what will their God look like? Will they have an idea of God? What were those stories? Because it will really be telling. I mean, that's almost the most interesting aspect of aliens, right? It's like, okay, you got your cool ships and your technology and whatever, but like, what is your relation to the ordering principle of the universe, or of reality, even, because the universe may be too narrow, but like, of experience? What's your relationship to that? And what if we end up we may find that it's completely different than ours? Or it'd be very interesting if we found that the same, if we're going along this theme where aligning with the ordering force of experience is what spirituality and religion is, we gain insights into that, and these become the archetypal stories and the philosophies that emerge for living better, or more in line with quote unquote God. It'll be really interesting to see what the aliens have come up with in that domain. It'd probably be it'll be very interesting, because either we realize that what we've been doing in that domain is strictly earthbound, right? Like, there's a totally different set of principles that emerge from engaging in reality or experience in other places, and they're only applicable, and then they're not applicable to Earth, or what we've come up with on Earth is only applicable here. Or we may find that they exist there as well, and that may give more credence to, it may further our spiritual understanding, and saying like, oh, maybe we're actually on the right path and trying to understand what this is all about. And we have more data points of other civilizations that have been wrestling with reality in a similar way, and extracting similar insights of how to be, how to exist, or how to exist most optimally or most properly. And I never thought about that before. I'd always just figured, aliens probably exist and maybe we'll see them, maybe we won't. But now that now that I think about it that way, that's probably the most interesting thing about them. It will be their relationship to the divine unknown, or the structure of reality, or God. That'll be the most interesting component of what we get from them, in my opinion.
Yeah, probably. In terms of a long-lasting impact, I would say the spiritual component is probably biggest. And in terms of like a short-term component, I mean, obviously technologies, right? Like whatever technologies I have are going to be pretty cool. But without the spiritual component, technologies are almost a bad thing. I mean, I hesitate to just like label things as good or bad strictly, but maybe it was Martin Luther King who said, we have guided missiles and misguided men, something like that. And it was basically the idea that like if your moral compass isn't evolving as quickly as your technologies, you're headed down the wrong path.
100%. And this is why it's, that's a super relevant issue for our day and age today, right? Because many countries have nuclear stockpiles, and I would make the case that we're in a diluted sort of time. We're in almost one of the most misguided times perhaps ever, and this is why, another reason why I'm so motivated to engage with Bitcoin and so excited about it, because it seems like a mechanism for deconditioning people and helping them see things with greater truth and clarity. And as a result of that, causing a transformation. So that's super hopeful, because, you probably, Mike and I talked about this in our chat as well, but like, it just seems that most people's minds are not their own. They're guided by conditioning or propaganda, or their emotions or delusions of various kinds. And I get it, because it's hard to see with clarity, and it's an intentional process to do so. But that, combined with, nuclear stockpiles, is a very, very dangerous mix. And so if we have any chance of, getting past the great filter, or even just persisting, because human beings are worth, it's good that human beings exist. That's got to change. And I don't see a mechanism more broadly applicable and more fast acting than Bitcoin for elucidating that change.
Yeah. I mean, Bitcoin it's a beast. It's an incredible beast. and one thing I love, like one huge breakthrough for me in the Bitcoin space, and there have been, many over the years, a big breakthrough was, what? This isn't just like a chunk of software that's not, which obviously could succeed or it could fail, the way any chunk of software could succeed or fail. Bitcoin, it's an idea. Like it's this idea of a global decentralized store of value, blah, blah, blah. And if the current software implementation somehow fails, however you want to define it, we can create a new software implementation that embodies the same ideals. Like the ideals, the ideology, the idea of a Bitcoin itself, it's not going to die. Like the idea of Bitcoin does not go to zero. The software might, BTC might, whatever. But like the idea of Bitcoin, like the idea of like building a society on like stable, sound money that is borderless and purely electronic and therefore easily transmissible, like that idea isn't going away. Like
Right.
that's the beautiful thing that for a couple years in Bitcoin I missed, and then when I all of a sudden got it, I was like, oh, okay, I'm completely in on this thing.
Right.
Because the idea is here. And one thing you mentioned in the beginning of our conversation was it was something like being invested in Bitcoin in terms of like a career and so forth. And another major catalyst for me was when a friend of mine, he asked me, "Hey, what are you doing these days for work?" I'm like, I'm not really working. I'm just kind of like working on Bitcoin and like creating content around Bitcoin." And because I made that decision and articulated it to him in that way, he was kind of like, wow, I've got to check out this thing that you're betting not just your money on, but your time and your career reputation and so forth. He's like, if you're going to put your time and your career behind this idea, I'm going to check out the idea. And that was so powerful because I've known him since we were 5 years old. And so like, I didn't expect that to happen, but when it did, it gave me goosebumps. I was like, wow, it is a huge impact. And everything you do matters.
Yeah. 100%. And what's really interesting about, again, I'm blanking on all the people who said these great quotes today, but there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come, right? And what's interesting about things like this, it's like, I don't think we know ourselves that well, especially not as a collective, right? As individuals, maybe a bit more. And that's why it's so interesting, but we do subconsciously build ourselves into our tools. It's like unavoidably, but a lot of it is probably the aspects of ourselves that we're not conscious of. So our tools can be tremendous teachers at teaching us about ourselves. And this is another reason why I think Bitcoin is so compelling, because it's probably the tool that we've constructed that has the most to teach us about ourselves. And I won't go too far into that, but just along the lines of what we've been discussing, one interesting thing to consider is, why did we build a tool that is open to everybody, that treats everyone the same, is fundamentally fair, has the protections in it to sanctify the sovereignty of the individual versus giving, someone an advantage or whatever. Like all of these values that are built into Bitcoin. Like nobody built a super corrupt network that would only favor the 1% and like screw over everybody else, right? Or maybe they have been built, but nobody was attracted to them, right? Because we're drawn to these principles of fairness and truth and openness. Why? Does that not tell us something about who we are in the structure of reality that we're in? That we've built these things into something, and it's sucking in, these principles are sucking in people from all over the world, all sorts of different walks of life and everything like that. Like, what can we infer about ourselves and how reality functions, that is the case? Why is it those principles that suck in everybody? Why is fairness such a powerful draw? Why is openness and truth such a powerful draw? So, those are the kind of things that are fun to speculate about as we meander down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I like that a lot. And the whole idea of Bitcoin sort of like flipping the incentive structure, but also sort of flipping the assumption structure, in the sense that the fiat system almost assumes that everyone is going to play by the rules. And then if somebody doesn't, like, it's catastrophic, right? If someone prints too much or whatever it is, again, it's based on all these like flawed assumptions, but like it assumes everyone's going to play nice and no one's going to, steal value from each other through inflation. But that's ridiculous. But Bitcoin assumes, like, what? There's bad people who are going to try to steal, and they're going to need, 51% of the network in order to do it, or whatever it is. Like, they're going to need insane amounts of energy or control or power to even try, and if they do, they destroy themselves as much as they destroy others, or more so. And so it almost like assumes that, what, people are going to succumb to temptation. Like, people are going to try to attack you, people are going to try to steal. Not everybody, but just there exist people who might try to do it. And the network is built in such a way that, like, it acknowledges the fact that not everyone is 100% honest all the time. And, and it's almost like by building that assumption into the model, it allows people to trust each other more, because fundamentally we assume that we don't trust each other all the time. And so ironically, it allows us to trust each other more because we acknowledge that, it's possible. But the fiat system, and the fact that it's centralized, and the particular nature of the system that is centralized, it assumes, like, okay, we trust our politicians, we trust our bankers, they're acting in the best interest of us. And as long as they do that, it's a great system. And I mean, how long did that last? Like a day? I mean, at most, and then, like, we've had 100 years of just like, well, let's steal a little bit more, but we get really great at telling people we're going to help the economy again today by stealing some more off the top,
Yeah. I think it's a great point. And again, this is one of the things that I find fascinating about the quote unquote community, the culture growing up around this thing, is like, by whatever mechanism is at play around trust, like you just articulated, it does seem to be the case that because maybe your most precious thing is not susceptible to the breaking of trust, that you're more confident in extending it to people because, there's fewer ways you can be harmed by doing so, or something like that. And that seems to be the case. I mean, the Bitcoiners, I've never even met any of the people, that I've talked to on the podcast, right? It's all been like this. Like, now I'll meet them at the conference in June, and I'm super pumped for that. But I trust a lot of these people way more than I trust anybody in my day-to-day life. Like, I consider a lot of them really good friends, and I feel like I could trust them with a lot. And once we seal the deal and we meet each other in person, I'll probably be to the point where I trust them with my life in certain respects. So it's a really fascinating phenomenon, to say the least.
It is big time. And this is obviously the first time we've talked. I mean, even like, we've never even like tweeted back and forth. I mean, this is like the first time. And I feel like I could trust you with like a lot, like a large percentage of, you know what I mean? Just because I don't think you're going to screw me over, maybe I'm naive, but like, yeah, it just feels so different. And, I don't trust, the system, and I don't trust the people who are running the system, not because I think they're bad people, connecting the dots. I think there's a divine essence in them. And I just think they're just in a bad place. And if you got them out of the place, out of the system or something, and sort of gave them like a chance to repent or something like that, I don't mean to sound like ridiculous in that way, but if they if they stepped outside of it, if they resigned from their, position in Congress or from the, chairman of the whatever, I think they would eventually seek truth, you might say, in there, and maybe it takes a decade or whatever it does, but like, it's so hard for me not to like maintain that view and be like, they're in an evil position, in an evil system, doing evil things, but they are not evil. It's like so hard, but I try. So yeah, I don't know. What do you think?
I totally agree with that. I mean, even as crazy as the world is right now, and there's both like far out conspiracy theories and far more sensible, attributions of malice to people in positions of power, and the assumption of alternative agendas that serve not the greater good, but very specific or narrow interests. And that could all be, first of all, that could all be true. But the thing is, we're probably never going to know. And how would it alter your behavior anyways? Like, if you knew that Bill Gates was just this evil character trying to take over the world, like, would you stand up and try to fight Bill Gates head on? Or would you try to establish as much sovereignty in your and independence in your own life as possible, so that you're both not influenced as much by those machinations, and that you connect with other people of a like-minded ilk, and you become stronger together? Like, so I don't spend much time on trying to figure out like really what's going on, because I'm not sure it matters in terms of what my approach would be to a solution. But in general, I agree that like, I don't think most people are evil, and they certainly don't consciously engage in evil behavior. Like, not a lot of people running around thinking like, I'm evil and I'm going to destroy stuff and this is going to be so fun. I think there's a lot wrapped up in it, but in line with what we've been discussing here, I think they're not holding themselves accountable to their behavior enough, and I think they're not being critical enough, and they're not being responsible enough with they're not sanctifying their behavior. Let's say, like, what we've been saying here is that we all have a divine essence, and we all contribute to the act of being. Therefore, we're all mini gods, right? And I don't think people that allow themselves to engage in behavior that they know is wrong, or if they're willfully ignorant about the implications or consequences of their behavior, I don't think they're respecting the divine within them and the impact of their behavior on the process and circumstance of being for themselves and for everybody else. So most of the time, I think it's incompetence. Not that that's an excuse, because again, you're not doing enough to make sure, like the hero doesn't willfully engage in incompetence, right? Because they know the dangers of doing so. So that's why the critical mind is, the hero often embodies the critical mind, because they want to make sure that they're not being led astray by incompetence or ignorance. And if you don't have enough scrutiny to have that attitude, well, then you probably will be led astray. And then you may end up engaging in behavior unknowingly that is not serving you, is not serving the collective, or serving you exclusively at the detriment to other people, or whatever system you're in. So yeah, I think it's mostly that, and we've been conditioned through the structure that we've been articulating, about fiat money and that kind of stuff, to be that way, to acquiesce to the demands of other people, to accept the consequence-free nature of this system that we're in, to quiet the voice inside of you that knows what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad, because it won't be detrimental to you, at least on the surface, if you go against that voice, right? You have that social sanction to go against that voice, and you won't be reprimanded for it, and you may even be rewarded for it, as is the case in politics and several other areas. So that's what I think is going on, is that people are not holding themselves to a high enough standard of engaging in reality truthfully, and trying to express the highest form of themselves in that circumstance that they're in. And it's done a lot of fucking shit to the world. And it speaks to the importance of that it's wound us up in such a mess in the world, right? That's why, because people aren't doing those things better or more. And so if we want to fix these problems, people have to start doing that. And, there's many ways to skin that cat. I just think it seems to be whatever characterizes the phenomenon around Bitcoin and how people feel when they take sovereignty over their money and they gain that independence and they come into a community that's kind of ferociously trying to understand all this stuff better, and that's very open to broad intellectual discussions and that kind of stuff. It just seems to be the way of getting people to change their thinking about a lot of this at scale, right? Whereas, when I was younger, I was like, well, I don't know, but maybe if everyone just took like 5 grams of mushrooms, in silent darkness, like people would wake up, and certainly that would jar their perspective a little bit. But I think, one, it's temporary. There's a lasting impression oftentimes in those experiences, and I don't want to denigrate that experience, but it's not a practical at scale solution, right? Whereas an economic solution, or at least a seemingly economic solution, which affects everybody all the time, every day, in multiple instances, and across both space and time, I think has a much greater chance at scaling its whatever positive effect it seems to be engendering. And so that's why I think Bitcoin's a bit of a sneaky way of us turning around this process that we've been articulating, of people not having faith in themselves ultimately, and not acting in accord with what they believe is truthful, both in themselves and in the broader world. And so if it takes a bit of greed for people to get in, for number go up, just to start paying attention, and then they kind of get exposure to these other ideas and these conversations and these ways of being, then that seems like the most scalable option to me. Because absent that, I don't see how the mess gets turned around.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if it weren't for Bitcoin, would we still be feeling this like consciousness revolution? I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to play the hypothetical game, but it's not like we can go back to 2008 and not write the Bitcoin white paper and then see what it would have been like without it. But yeah, it's
I just think it's you have these peak experiences, and then you come down and the world is the same, right? Like ultimately, you said it earlier, like we don't need Bitcoin theoretically, but we just know that at scale trust breaks down. And that's why, like, you could say we're going to print $100 million, and that's going to be money for the world forever. And we're never ever going to print any more. And that would actually work. But the fact is that gets corrupted. If it can be corrupted, it will be corrupted. And that's why the question around Bitcoin is so juicy. Is this the incorruptible system, right? Have we fused technology and human psychology and economic incentives and probably, some other things, and have we put them together in such a way that we've actually created something that's incorruptible? That's the question, because that's all it's seeking to do is keep us from corrupting ourselves, right? Because and that's why everything previously has failed. So, but my point was, like, that gives us a mechanism to affect change and to engage in something structurally and not just internally with our own consciousness, right? Like, we can actually, it's like a brick, you can come back from a peak experience, whether it be psychedelic or otherwise, and think you're somewhat enlightened or your perspective is forever changed or whatever. But the tools at your disposal to build that kind of ethic that you've been imbued with into the world are still lacking. It hasn't bestowed on you any greater tools external to yourself. Bitcoin, I think, changes that. It gives you a phenomenal tool to actually imbue those values and those principles and those ethics that you might have, or those truths that you might have encountered in that space, and actually kind of build it into the world with this as the primary tool. And that's great. And I think that's also why, like, we'll probably see a renaissance of, I think a lot of people in Bitcoin, by virtue of their curiosity, have and will continue to explore the psychedelic realms, because there's a lot of interesting intellectual and spiritual questions to be answered in those places. And I think in the future, when we imagine like the future hyper Bitcoinized society, one, those experiences won't be stigmatized and taboo as they are today in society. And even in today's society, we're starting to see that taboo lessen to some degree and legalization changing. But I think it'll be just almost a rite of passage, like a fundamental aspect of society, that, that these experiences are at least experienced once in someone's life, so that they have a fuller picture of what the experience of consciousness is. And so I think they'll grow together, and awesome, because two phenomenal tools, they're joining forces for the betterment of the individual and for the betterment of all. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah, it's super beautiful. And one thing I just want to relate is that I've had a life coach for the last, I don't know, 2.5 years, and we talk about so many of the same topics that you and I have talked about today. And it's a really beautiful experience. I love it. He's a beautiful person. But the reason I mention it is because I kind of started with Bitcoin and then shifted to all these spiritual kind of things and developed this language of like abundance versus scarcity, and seeing the divine essence in other people, and developing all these terms and sort of incorporating them into my life after. And he has come from a place of, he's kind of like walked the spiritual path, you might say, and he's really big on consciousness and all these things. And I've introduced him to Bitcoin, and he's just ripe for it, because like he's coming at it from the other angle, and now he's learning about finance and the monetary system and all these other things. And it's just so beautiful to see these two worlds collide and sort of like intertwine themselves, and people come at Bitcoin, or come at the truth, let's say. Not that Bitcoin is the truth. I should be careful there, but people come at the truth from different angles, and sometimes it's via Bitcoin, and then they hit something about spirituality, or sometimes it's via spirituality, and then they hit Bitcoin. And it seems like this beautiful dance that, like, I mean, it doesn't feel wrong. It doesn't feel like a lie. It doesn't feel like a Ponzi scheme. It doesn't feel like a bubble. It doesn't feel like a grand deception. It feels very much like the path of truth. And people who aren't on it just think a lot of us are crazy. So I don't know.
Which is it's I think in times in the past when paradigm shifts have occurred, that's kind of always the same, that you think the first people on board are crazy, because they're literally the ones that are saying, things are different now. Everything is different now. And you people need to wake up. You need to, drop your preconceived notions and your conditioned behavior and thinking, and realize that something different is here now. And it means, and it's significant, and it's significant for your life and for your behavior. So, and look, what I've noted, yes, we're all a little bit quirky. But my experience has been we're all also like articulate, and we do our best to inform ourselves, and we try to be educated in the things that are meaningful to us. And like, maybe that gives us a bit of an edge, and of course, if you're on Bitcoin Twitter, like it's a rowdy place, and we're not shy about telling normies that, like, pointing out their faults, to put it lightly. But we're not like crazy without justification, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Like, we're not just crazy for the sake of it. Like, this has always been my stance with people in my meat space life. But like, I'm fine if you want to disagree with me and call me crazy. But a lot of people don't end up having the discussion with me about like whatever the issue is. I think because they know I'm not going to have a strong opinion on something without being fairly well informed on it. And so I welcome like a really good, informed, rigorous back and forth about something, because I want to refine my perspective all the time. And if a rigorous discussion means I come out of it with a better understanding or a more refined perspective, then that's wonderful. But most of the time, like, if people are really going to come at you for being crazy, they attack you rather than, the subject matter or the argument, because I think we come to the table having been disciplined in our pursuit of these things. And as a result, we're able to defend our assertions. And so, when people call me crazy about Bitcoin, I'm like, well, step up to the plate and let's throw down. I'll do my best to defend why I'm so enthusiastic about this thing, and I'd love to hear your rebuttal.
Yeah, it's true. And I'm the same way. There's not many things in this world that I would like, put my foot down and say like, this is true, or like, this is the way, or this is better than its alternatives. Very few things in the world, but Bitcoin is one of them. So I'm the same way. I feel like I've done my homework and can articulate, why I have the position that I do. But something, I used to get frustrated, or I used to frustrate myself, if I'm being precise with my words, trying to refute people who aren't sincerely ready to hear a refutation of whatever it is they believe. And typically in the past, it's been, I like XYZ altcoin, it's better than Bitcoin, you're dumb, that type of thing. And it's, I just discovered a principle, or a law, like a social law. I forget the name. Like, it's like I think Italian, like Bernolini or something. The Bernolini law, or something like that. I'll put it in the description. But the idea is that it takes an order of magnitude more energy to refute bullshit than to produce it.
Right.
Yeah.
I've heard that.
Yeah. So like, you can just say anything like, this coin is better and Bitcoin uses too much energy. And then like, okay, that took you like 4 seconds to just spew out of your mouth. And it's going to take me forever to like compose, well, actually,
that's where have fun staying poor came from, right? It's like,
yeah,
I'm not refuting this. You just have fun staying poor. You do your thing. I'll do my thing,
yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And it was so nice when I saw Satoshi's post on whatever message board, back in 2009 or 10, when he just said like, I don't have time to convince you. If you don't believe it, just, I don't have time. And I'm like, well, that's so beautiful. Like, of course, like, of course that's the attitude. Like, so
Satoshi said so much already. If you go back and read a lot of his stuff, you're like, a lot of these things have come up way before now. And Satoshi had, some pretty good comebacks and liners and phrases to a lot of this stuff, and that's certainly one of them.
Yeah.
Because also, look, I want people I care about to understand this stuff, and I enjoy talking about it. But like, again, even if we're wrong about like this being the incorruptible substance, and if we're being a bit hyperbolic about it, or if we're misseeing it, it still seems like it's going to be a force for a lot of good in the world, even if it disintegrates 10 years from now. The next 10 years, I think it'll bring a lot of fairness and freedom to the world. And that in itself would be great, right? And that in itself would be a cause for tremendous enthusiasm and hope and all that kind of stuff. If I've got to convince you that hard to see it, like, it's just, I don't know. Why, right? What's the point? It's like you said right at the beginning, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. It's like, yeah, Satoshi said it perfectly. If you don't see it, you don't get it. I don't have time to explain it to you. I'm more concerned with enhancing my own understanding, connecting with people who do see it, talking about all these ideas, building different things. Like that's what's going to make the difference here, not winning people over in persuasive arguments one at a time. Like this thing will assert itself, and people will get in at the price they deserve, and hopefully they'll experience, the transformations as a result of doing so, to varying degrees and varying timelines and stuff like that. But I think the best case to be made is what Bitcoin is, the functions it performs, and the culture that seems to be emerging around it. Like that will be the thing that draws everybody in. All these arguments and discussions we have is basically just us trying to rationalize ourselves to people that we don't really have to rationalize ourselves to. Like when friends come at you and you're like, with that attitude, like you said, they're not really interested in learning. They just kind of want to prod and poke and deride you a little bit, really. We don't have to defend ourselves to those people. We're doing our thing and we think it's meaningful, and everyone else can do the same. And you place your bets and the chips fall where they may. So, but it's phenomenal to be here, man. It's like I said at the beginning, like to have a front row seat to this stuff and to be speaking to people, and conversations like this. Like, I mean, it's such a privilege and a gift to have this be something that I can legitimately spend time on, to have these discussions, because they're great, and I think they're meaningful, and I know people get stuff from them because people reach out to me all the time, and it's a trip because all I'm doing is trying to learn and then trying to put what I've learned through my own lens and then put it back out there to see if I can refine it even further. So it's like, pretty much an entirely self-serving sort of thing. But people are enjoying it, and I gain so much from that interaction that I get from them as a result. And we all kind of participate in this thing together. And it seems like a pretty awesome thing to me.
Yeah. I mean, I love being a part of it. Yeah, and of course, this was an amazing conversation. So thank you so much for your time. We could talk all day. We got to end it somewhere, but so thank you so much. The big thing about trying to convince people is I realized, like, okay, when I felt that need to convince, my friend Joe or Steve or whoever it is, it's like I realized I was coming from a place of scarcity, not a place of abundance. Like I had this need, like, and it was an ego need. Like I want to be like that guy's savior or something, or like, show him the light, and that wasn't healthy. That was almost like at odds with like the Bitcoin ethos of just abundance. And so, yeah, abundance is like, what, we just do what we do. And the horses who want to drink are going to drink. Like, yeah.
So. And like to draw an analogy, just to put a cherry on the top of this thing, it's also the case that, back in high school, if you were the guy like going after the girl super hard, she would ignore you. She would take you for granted, all this kind of stuff. But if you played it cool and you just did your thing and you enjoyed yourself, they would come to you, right? And I think that's what's happening with Bitcoin, right? It's this vibrant, emergent culture of happy, fulfilled, engaged people. And that's going to attract people just by virtue of doing that, not arguing or trying to persuade people. So that's why I keep saying, like, regardless of what agendas are at play in the world, regardless of what people think, I think the best approach for us is to engage in this thing in the manner that feels most meaningful and interesting to us. And that'll be enough, and just let it play out on whatever timeline it's supposed to play out on.
Yeah, for sure. Amazing. Okay, so I guess my last question. So if people want to get in touch with you, obviously there's Twitter, there's your podcast, right? Bitcoin Rapid Fire. What else? Are you working on different projects, or where do you want to direct people?
No, those are it. If people want to get in touch with me, Twitter is usually the best. And there's a YouTube channel as well if you're more visually inclined. But those are the three best locations. And man, I just want to thank you for the conversation. It's great to connect with you, and I'm always kind of stunned at just the quality of people that are in this space and that I get to engage with, and it's such a pleasure. So thanks for having me on.
Yeah, man. Thank you. I appreciate it. Really appreciate your time. It's been great talking to you, and I look forward to more in the future, Twitter and otherwise. So thanks a lot, man. Really appreciate it. Take care.
100%. See you, buddy.